Today, just wonderful to be here. It's always a special day when the East-West Center and the UH Center for Pacific Island Studies are able to co-sponsor a talk with such a special visitor. And it's a rare opportunity, I would say, to gain some insights and hear some things that we don't ordinarily hear. I'd like to take this moment to introduce a special visitor who won't be able to stay the whole time because the legislature is in session. But joining us is Senator Kalani English. Now, his official bio says that he represents Maui, but I think he represents all of Hawaii and the entire Pacific. So thank you for joining us. Dr. James Viernes has recently taken on a number of major new responsibilities with regard to the Center for Pacific Island Studies, but he is a son of Guam and a proud graduate of the University. If you would do the honors, please.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. As Jerry has said, my name is James Viernes, and I'm at the Center for Pacific Island Studies here at UH Manoa. In addition to our honored guests today, we have two very special guests who have come a long way to be with us here today. So I'd like to introduce them. First is former Senator and Dr. Narissa Britannia Underwood, Dr. Underwood's wife. Welcome. Thank you for getting him here to us today. I know it's been a long trip, so we thank you for taking the time. I am very honored to have been asked to help coordinate this event and to introduce our speaker because up until about 2 months ago, he was my boss. At the University of Guam, a very supportive person of indigenous Chamorro scholars on the island, so it gives me great pleasure to introduce him. As many of you know, he does not need very much of an introduction, but just to bring it together. The Honorable Dr. Robert Underwood, he is an indigenous Chamorro scholar, a political leader and statesman from Micronesia, and a cultural advocate for Guam, Mariana Islands, and Micronesia. He is a former member of the U.S. Congress and is currently the president of the University of Guam. And as an educator, he's been everywhere from the high school classroom to curriculum development, to administration, to serving as the Dean of the College of Education and Academic Vice President at UOG. As you know, he's a distinguished scholar with a long publication record based on education, regional political issues, indigenous concerns, and cultural change. He did serve in the U.S. Congress from 1993 to 2003 in a very distinguished career, during which he sponsored major legislation for Guam. He played an active role in the Department of Defense authorization bills and was a force of nature in advocating for political development for the insular areas in the Pacific Islands. So please join me in welcoming President Robert Underwood, University of Guam.
Masi James, and thank you very much for that introduction. Hafade, aloha, and konnichiwa, as they say in the Department of Interior. So, you know, this is really a great opportunity. I remember many years ago, well, maybe a long time ago, just a, you know, I've had my life intersect with many of you over the years, so, you know, but you just have to forgive me if I just mention a couple of them. One is with Dr. Brisman here, when he was writing for the Pacific Daily News. It was the first time he wrote a column, and it was the first time I saw my name in print. So it was a really auspicious thing, and what had happened is I was asked to be a deputy director of education, and Narissa was superintendent of education as part of her career, but I was asked to be deputy director of education, and at the time I asked the director, I said, how long is this going to last? I said, is it going to last at least a month? You know, so I knew that there was a change in administration, and when I got down there was a big hue and cry. I was gone in 2 days. I've never been able to put it on my resume. I just kind of cryptically refer to it. I was an administrator. But and then with Karen, I remember Knudsen when I was here, I think it was the early 80s, and I gave a talk for Pacific Asia.
With the teacher strike in Guam, you caused us a lot of problems.
Yeah. So when I showed, she kind of greeted me and she said, would you care for some police protection? And I said, wow, police protection. The only person I really know here is Donald Topping, and now he and I have had a disagreement from time to time, but I don't think Donald Topping wants to physically hurt me. Of course, it turned out I was giving a talk, and it was in the type of the Guam teacher strike, and there were a couple of people who were refugees from Guam who were very unhappy about me. And they said, I went up to the restaurant, and the restaurant owner said, "Are you Robert Underwood? Yeah, you're a very bad man." Really, I'm a very bad man. How did I know? So I've been, in any event, trying to, this morning, and it's, what I have to say is actually a pretty simple thesis. I do want to acknowledge all the people from Guam that are here. I have to acknowledge Dr. Seantalan and Dr. Patrick Letty, they're our longtime colleagues of mine in Guam and here in Hawaii. The topic is the U.S. affiliated islands in Micronesia. And U.S. affiliated is a kind of curious way of referring to independent nations and the territory of Guam and the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas, which comprises Micronesia and located within the American Lake. And what we're talking about is the American Lake and how the lake has changed, and maybe the American Lake no longer exists. U.S. affiliated disguises the relationships. The term U.S. affiliated disguises the relationships of direct control over Guam and the CNMI, and perhaps actually overstates the relationship with the technically independent and freely associated states of the Republic of the Marshall Islands and Federated States of Micronesia and Republic of Palau. I guess U.S. affiliated is kind of a midpoint way of referring to it. I want to discuss the relationship of these islands to current and future security and strategic issues in the Asian Pacific region. These islands have historically been important to the strategic situation in the Asian Pacific region. President Trump now refers to the entire area as the Indo-Pacific region, and others have followed suit. He hasn't yet had the opportunity to rename Micronesia or give us any one of his patented nicknames, but he may yet remind us that we're just little islands in the middle of a very big ocean. The Micronesian islands' strategic importance or lack thereof has always really undergirded all policies towards the island over the years by the U.S. Over the years. From the end of World War II until the end of the 20th century, the geographical expanse that we refer to has always been called by some people the American Lake. These islands always haven't been U.S. affiliated. Historically, these islands, except for Guam, were part of a Japanese League of Nations mandate from World War I up until World War II. Guam was an American island in the midst of an increasingly militarized set of islands occupied by Japan in the run-up to World War II. The war in the Pacific brought an end to the Japanese administration, and the islands collectively were brought into the post-war world as the trust territory of the Pacific Islands. As with other entities detached from enemy states of World War II and holdovers from the mandate system, the trust territory was created under the auspices of the United Nations, but unlike the other trust territories, the TTPI was designated a strategic trust in 1947. And unlike the other trust territories, the TTPI could only be dissolved by the Security Council and not by the General Assembly. And so the U.S. has a veto in the Security Council, and so therefore it was the only trust territory that had this special designation. The struggle over the American lake really began pretty early, and the first struggle over the American lake was between the Army and the Navy. Who's going to control this American lake? So in the American bureaucracy argued over who would manage this newly acquired area. Concern about a possible Pearl Harbor in the future and the looming rivalry with the Soviet Union, American military planners quickly went to work and crafted new ideas over how to militarize these islands. And this generated this rivalry between the Army and the Navy, and eventually they were united in their effort by the creation of the Department of Defense, and so that ended the rivalry between the Army and the Navy. And then they sort of struggled with the Department of Interior over who would administer these islands. These struggles are outlined in Friedman's Arguing Over the American Lake, Bureaucracy and Rivalry in the U.S. Pacific from 1945 to 47. Eventually, the Department of Interior became the administering agency as one of the final decisions under the Truman administration. This brought the trust territory administratively on the same level as the territories of Guam, American Samoa, and the Virgin Islands. This hybrid situation in which the Department of Interior has administrative management over programs in the foreign countries of the freely associated states in Micronesia, of course, continues to today. This did not keep the Department of Defense and security agencies from operating in the trust territory. The actual militarization of the islands was made possible by this distinctive trust territory, quote, strategic trust, over the next decade, nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands, and the use of Saipan in the Viernes as a counterinsurgency training facility named the Naval Tactical Training Unit. This included activities in Southeast Asia and assisting nationalist Chinese. The absolute arrogance of these activities was given various justifications over the time. It was really the most classic piece of imperialist exploitation by the United States, and it occurred after World War II. That's the amazing thing about it. This is the most classic piece of America. It even rivals what happened around the time of the Spanish-American War. And all of this occurred after World War II. And it was, of course, papered over with the flimsiest of excuses and authority. As we look at those days, the old saying in the trust territory came to mind. The islanders had the trust and the Americans had the territory. Now, whether it was DOI or DOD, the UN General Assembly, or Security Council, Guam was always considered differently because of its territorial status. Although it was placed in the UN system of non-self-governing territories, Guam's militarization was always going to be the central point, the crossroads of American military resources and strategy in the American lake. Guam easily became the most militarized island society in the entire Pacific after World War II, with Okinawa and Hawaii having a larger presence, but proportionately and comparatively impacting less of each island's way of life and landmass. No one could compare with the militarization of Guam. Almost 50% of the island was immediately taken for post-war military bases, and the island's transformation into the power projection point for America into Asia quickly became cemented. Army bases, Air Force bases, Navy facilities were large, and their combined population was larger than the civilian population until 1960. Guam's role in the Korean War and the Vietnam War reflected the main purpose of the use of these islands in the projection of American power into Asia. Guam was the platform for the projection of power and was not originally limited to ships and planes, but included massive army bases. In the 21st century, Guam will become home to a rotating force of 5,000 Marines. Guam has always had strategically what they call the 7-7 advantage over Hawaii, in that it is closer by 7 sailing days and 7 flying hours to potential conflicts anywhere in Asia. Moreover, it did not require the mother may I request needed in the utilization of bases in foreign countries, whether it was in the Philippines, Thailand, Korea, or Japan in the succeeding decades after World War II. Guam was the metropole and remains the metropole of the American Military Strategic Lake. In combination with the TTPI, Guam gave Lake America form and substance. The lake provided a strategic security blanket for the U.S. Now, during most of the Cold War, this American lake was a mainstay of strategic thinking about the U.S. and Asia. With the rise of discordant voice, it became clear in the 1960s that the U.S. needed to deal with the future political administration of the TTPI. After all, the U.S. resisted the notion that they were imperialists and denied the existence of colonial areas. However, unlike the other trust territories, there was no movement towards anything approaching independence, and the U.S. needed to be prodded into action. The neglect of the TTPI under the Department of Interior and the abuses of authority became part of the propaganda of the Cold War as played out in the United Nations. This became particularly acute and embarrassing as the forces of decolonization swept the former imperial holdings of the United Kingdom, France, and others. In response, the U.S. typically did one thing. They spent more money. It increased resources spent in the trust territory by almost 1,000% over the course of 5 to 6 years at the tail end of the Kennedy administration. Also in the Kennedy administration was the issuance of NASM, National Security Council Memo number 145, better known as the Solomon Report. It outlined a plan to politically assimilate the people of the trust territory under American sovereignty. This plan was developed while the U.S. spoke of meeting its international responsibilities of leading the inhabitants of the trust territory towards independence, as was the expectation of every other trust territory. This was the vision of how to keep the strategic picture intact without creating major risk or disruption in Lake America. It became the political blueprint for an American lake in the middle of the Pacific. The islanders themselves, of course, had very different expectations about their future. The post-World War II generation of Micronesian leaders was educated and aware of their options. Ironically, they were assisted by Peace Corps volunteers, probably some in this room right now, who were originally sent to the area to serve as extensions of American influence. As the activities of the islanders confounded the expected outcome of the Solomon Report, the concept of political assimilation was abandoned in favor of freely associated status. The centrifugal forces of ethnic divisions and geographic distance eventually prevailed, and of course the 3 freely associated states were created. In order to assuage the Marianas Islanders, who were originally predisposed to join with Guam, but no longer anymore, those days are gone, as they were at once in former times. And in order to act as a hedge for future military activities, the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas Islands was established. This new addition to American sovereignty gave military planners, or so they thought, land options in Tinian and the right to exercise sovereign authority. This was certainly absent in the freely associated states, except for the site in Kwajalein and the Marshall Islands. While the negotiations worked their way towards the compacts of free association and independence, the strategic picture still seemed secure. The Cold War came to an end, and all that was needed was to ensure that Americans could always keep others from coming into the area. This concept, the concept of strategic denial, emerged as the descriptive phrase for the region's strategic posture and the American objective. John Fairlam of the Office of Compact Negotiations for the State Department stated in 2002, the most significant U.S. interest at the time the compact was negotiated was the value placed on the right to exercise strategic denial of over 500,000 square miles of the Pacific Ocean between Hawaii and Guam to the military forces of other nations. While the Cold War is over, no one can foresee what specific threats have to be addressed in the future. The Bush's administration security policy includes a strong focus on the Pacific region. Strategic denial, therefore, remains a prudent insurance policy for U.S. security in the Pacific. Strategic denial means that defense agreements and foreign policy coordination would always keep America preeminent in the region, since other political potential challengers could be kept out. Large flying areas east of the Marianas, use of Farallon de Medellín, FDM, for target practice, could be reserved for aircraft training exercises by U.S. and friendly nations. Waters around the islands provide more than adequate maneuvering for warships, including submarines. The 3 carrier task forces that were summoned to Korea by President Trump late last year for a show of force sailed right through that area and conducted some training exercises while they were passing through the American lake. The compacts with the Marshals and the FSM were negotiated in the 1980s and passed by Congress in 1986. They were subsequently reviewed in 2003 for another 20 years and are scheduled for termination in 2023. The CNMI came into existence in 1976, and the Republic of Palau Compact went into effect in 1994 for 50 years. These agreements provide the basis for strategic denial. The compacts allow the United States to operate armed forces in compact areas, to demand land for operating bases subject to negotiation, and excludes the militaries of other countries without U.S. permission. It's kind of an interesting arrangement you have with independent countries. The U.S. in turn becomes responsible for protecting the freely associated states and responsible for administering all international defense treaties and affairs, although it may not declare war on their behalf. But the compact states are always willing participants in any kind of U.S.-led, like the coalition of the willing, they called it. You can always count them to be members of the coalition of the willing. It is not allowed to use nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons in Palau territory. In the RMI and the FSM, the U.S. is not allowed to store such weapons except in times of national emergency, state of war, or when necessary to defend against an actual or impending attack on the U.S., the RMI, or the FSM, and that's subject, of course, to broad definition. As part of the compacts of free association, citizens of the associated states may serve in America's armed forces. This is not a minor factor in the relationship between the U.S. and the inhabitants of the American lake. In 2008, the FSM had a higher per capita enlistment rate than any U.S. state and had more than 5 times the national casualty rate per capita in Iraq and Afghanistan. Moreover, military enlistment frequently attracts the best and the brightest in the relatively small populations of these island communities. It is sometimes seen as a kind of disruptive kind of opportunity which is coveted by many individuals. The recently released movie Island Soldier, which I recommend that you watch, outlines the impact on Kashrai, one of the states of the FSM. Within the past 2 decades, doubts about the American lake started to surface as the rise of China economically and militarily became a prominent international phenomenon. China's willingness to confront nearby nations on territorial claims in the so-called South China Sea and the expansion of their navy has been joined to its growing economic power to present a potential challenger to American preeminence. In 1997, Eric Margolis wrote that the Pacific won't always be an American lake. Writing in the Toronto Sun at the time of the turnover of Hong Kong, Margolis noted that China's economic growth is feeding its military modernization. Part of this growth is the renewal of Chinese territorial claims in the South China Sea. He counsels that the U.S. should accept this in good grace and understand that criticisms about a lack of democracy or human rights in Hong Kong or other places is seen by China as slightly hypocritical. The U.S. willingly accepts authoritarian regimes in the Middle East when American interests are at stake. In fact, today, President Trump just congratulated President Putin on a remarkable electoral victory, another goal for democracy in the world. 14 years later, in 2011, Margolis declared that the North Pacific is no longer an American lake. This assertion came as a result of Chinese growing maritime power, reflected in 60 modern submarines and the development of J-20, a stealth aircraft, and 2 aircraft carriers, one already launched, and the next one will be launched in 2020. Writing in The Diplomat last year, Thomas Mastalski warns that the end of the compacts, scheduled in 2023 and possibly accelerated, will inadvertently drive the Micronesian into the arms of China and simultaneously leave a gaping hole in strategic access. The implication is that strategic access for China is possible and is now undermining any notion of strategic denial. The Chinese first, second, and third island chain strategy, articulated in the 20th century, now has China being able to access the second chain. So the first chain is, pretty close to the China. The second chain cuts from Japan right through the Viernes down to Papua New Guinea. Hawaii's in the third chain. You're still safe. The third island chain runs from the Aleutians to Hawaii and seems pretty remote at this time. Mastalski warns that an FSM falling into the long-term sphere of Chinese influence leaves Guam at risk and other key allies in the region with much more to think about regarding their relationships with the U.S. Just the thought of this changes the whole nature of how you think about the diplomacy and security and the future. This is a very sobering view of the possibilities of China's entry into the former American lake and the disruption of the entire security picture. Chinese military planners have it's interesting, they kind of change their tune when they start to think about these things. Tried to preempt the island chain thinking earlier this year. Eli Huang, writing in the National Interest, writes that the People's Liberation Army Navy, called PLAN, criticized the island chain strategy as originally an American concept. The chains were the basis of containment for the U.S. of influences going eastward. The Chinese counter to the containment was to outline the areas of penetration and an extension of the areas of penetration and the extension of their own deep water naval capabilities. These island chains are now labeled by the Chinese as just not geographical barriers, but as psychological barriers, kind of serving as navigational tools for the Liaoning carrier group to travel around the Pacific hundreds of miles away from the Chinese coast. What used to be seen as a limitation is now seen as a guide for the next step. The Chinese military strategic assets do not really pose a challenge to American military assets as they exist today, but they demonstrate penetration and they provide evidence that the waters are now a contested field. The lake has become a river of military and economic currents from various sources. In combination with economic penetration and diplomatic initiatives, the role of China becomes larger in the life of Pacific Islanders, especially in the FSM. Although many young people join the U.S. military today, it is also rumored that there are dozens attending universities in China. Inevitably, they will return to the FSM, most of them, and they will be speaking Mandarin, and they will have some affinity for China, and they will become prominent in the life of the FSM in the future. This is very unlike the ones joining the military, because the ones joining the U.S. military are not likely to go back home until much later in life. But the ones that are going to school in China are going to go back home to the FSL. In discussing security concerns in Micronesia, U.S. agencies, state and the Department of Justice, through the U.S. attorneys and sometimes Department of Defense, has emphasized concerns about transnational crime as security vulnerabilities in Micronesia, especially with relatively weak governmental capacity to monitor and fight sophisticated criminal organizations coming from Asia. More significant is the economic penetration in the region. China is making inroads in Micronesia. The Pacific Island Times reported in February 2017 on dominant tourism to Palau from China, the construction of a mega resort in Yap by Chinese developers, the reliance on China for tourists in the Northern Marianas, and of course the best Sunshine Casino in Saipan. These economic activities need not be seen as strategically disruptive, except that claims going back over 10 years by various Chinese observers have described economic assistance and penetration as vehicles for political, although not necessarily military strategic penetration. Combined with a rash of stories about Chinese spending on public buildings and goodwill projects in the South Pacific, China is clearly extending its influence in and through and far beyond the American lake. Today, we not only have a different situation with China in that we have a potentially radically different situation regarding the purposes for which we pursue American military strength and strategic stability in the Micronesian part of the world. The purpose, it seems to me, the purpose of the extension of American power and influence in some form of international security has shifted over time, but that admixture of goals included a robust list of national objectives, which include political influence, economic penetration, and democratic values. Strategic security based almost entirely on military strength stands on its own only in times of extreme conflict, as in war, or in the positioning of America in the immediate post-World War II period. In those times, it was pretty obvious that the onset of the Cold War shaped the dynamics of what happened in the American lake and undergirded the rationale for nearly all activities. In nearly every possible way, the positioning of American forces in Guam and in Asia, combined with the concept of strategic denial for the areas covered by the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands, gave the U.S. unchallenged strategic military strength in that area. This was designed to prevent competitors from having the opportunity to shape or challenge the strategic balance, which was largely in America's favor. The U.S. did this so that it could maintain its political influence, engage in commerce, and foster trade in the larger Asian Pacific region, which ostensibly would be of mutual benefit. As a nation, America also engaged in humanitarian projects and touted democratic values. Strategic security didn't exist for its own sake, but was meant to provide an international order that was favorable towards American interests. And again, these are broadly defined to include economic objectives such as trade and a kind of a mutual trade, increased trade for everybody, and subsequent prosperity for all concerned. Economic penetration and then the development of mutually beneficial relations are balanced on the basis of overarching security and national interests. There's also the extension of American interests and purposes, which speak to the values of American society, the extension of democracy, and the protection of human rights. And these are sometimes connected to military objectives as fairness, as when we speak about the rule of law and the protection of intellectual property. It is a complex series of activities which require soft and hard power, the State Department as well as the Department of Defense, and a strategic vision about American interests which goes beyond just flexing your muscles. We're not supposed to just flex muscles just to demonstrate that we have muscles. But depending upon the era and the leadership of a given moment, American national interests are defined in terms of a world order dependent upon American power or a world order influenced by American values. These are usually connected in what appears to be a seamless approach. They're not easily separated, nor should they be. Democratic values are not just the cynical justification for the extension of American power. Pursuit of strategic stability, economic benefits, and democratic values simultaneously or in some combination should mark the United States as unique among nations. Of course, they're not equally pursued in different circumstances, but human rights and democratic values should carry the day in certain circumstances. This was the American hand in various forms that has been played since the end of World War II. This hand is not as clear today in the Trump era. In the Trump era, democracy and human rights are barely a whisper in the cacophony of international relations. In the Asia trip by President Trump last year, we bore witness to an interesting mixture of personal diplomacy, economic certainty and disengagement, and a display of military strength with no apparent purpose other than to display some kind of resolve, they call it. We display our resolve without clarifying our resolution. The President clearly articulated his view of the world consisting of bilateral trade relationships, state sovereignty, and an increased use of the term Indo-Pacific region. Somehow, this is supposed to decenter China as the center of Asian-Pacific dynamism. Its primary use has been to discuss maritime movements between the Indian Ocean, across the South China Sea, and into the Western Pacific. This was in stark contrast to the Asia rebalance and the Pacific pivot, so often spoken about by President Obama that it was almost routine. The new balance never got here, and the pivot only started when Obama left. For his part, President Trump has relabeled the region, announced his withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and announced that he was going to bilaterally fix all of the trade issues left over from previous administrations. It seems like the presidents resisted the rebalance and the pivot, not because they were defective, but because they were not his ideas. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was the American antidote to Chinese economic growth. Interestingly, it's still going on without the U.S., and Japan has played a leading role. The negotiations for reducing or easing trade barriers continued on in Da Nang, Vietnam as a part of APEC, even as the president left and went to the Philippines. The president's desire to bilaterally fix complex trade deals while everyone is acting multilaterally seems wildly out of sync in today's world. In Forbes magazine, Phil Levy writes that Trump's approach reflects core misunderstandings about how trade works and focuses on making individual trade deals while ignoring trade relationships. He remains focused on bilateral deals while everyone else is focused on trade as an international system. In the Philippines, there was no effort, none whatsoever, to focus on President Duterte's extrajudicial killing of thousands of drug dealers. Human rights and the rule of law were glaringly absent in the words exchanged in Manila. The White House claimed that human rights were mentioned in direct talks. The Philippines made no such acknowledgement. The concept of human rights was relegated to a minor commodity in the establishment of a bromance between Rodrigo and Donald. Even as the two leaders proclaimed their love for each other, the U.S. has now slipped to number 3 as a trade partner for the Philippines. Actual trade and human rights were both slipping from the scene. It opens up the question about the meaning and purpose of international relations and military strategic thinking for the U.S. Military security in this strategic picture carries no greater vision or greater weight beyond itself in achieving American national goals because the goals are limited and restrictive. The grander purposes to which the extension of American soft and hard power now seem unclear as American goals seem to shrink under the retrenchment of making America great again. The role of military security becomes defensive in tone rather than shaping the environment. The former American lake had extensive military activities that traversed the region. Today it still does. The linchpin of the lake was Guam, with a robust military capacity that could project power into Asia and other parts of the world easily, and with extensive fuel and weapons storage facility. Guam was the tip of the spear, and the surrounding islands supported the tip by denying others the opportunity to affect the spear. Guam is experiencing an expansion in military presence which will bring 5,000 Marines to Guam on a rotating basis. With the Marine Corps buildup, Guam's spear tip will be sharpened through live fire training capacity in Guam and access to facilities in the Northern Marianas. Local community opposition in Guam and the CNMI has delayed these projects, although presumably they will continue in some fashion. Interestingly, CNMI leaders are emboldened in their opposition by the investment of a multi-billion-dollar casino in Saipan, rumored between $3 and $7 billion. And when the federal officials show up to the CNMI and say, we have in our pocket $300 million worth of military facilities, just looks like chump change. These investors are from Macau. The potential economic benefits of military activities in the CNMI are easily overshadowed by this massive foreign investment. They can resist military construction because there is a larger client who's already making their presence felt. The American lake no longer exists as an exclusive enterprise. However, the region is still American dominated through communication networks, transportation routes, financial activities, and political relationships cemented in treaty provisions in the Compacts of Free Association. Guam's military presence and access to huge areas for naval and air force exercises. Despite all of this, anybody who's been there for a long period of time, it certainly feels different today than it does 30 years ago, when the Compacts of Free Association came into being. The lake used to appear to have an integrated purpose that combined American democratic values and economic benefits and penetration with political participation and partnership. Right now, it just seems like it's just the military, and it just feels defensive. The tip of the spear understands the meaning of being trusted into uncharted conflict, but at times it feels today like it's more a shield than a spear. Guam remains at the strategic center of this region because of the extensive military assets. In former days, Guam felt like it was the center of region for all other purposes as well, but there's been a subtle change in that as well. It is important to note that U.S. sovereignty extends only to Guam and the CNMI, a combined 995,000 square kilometers in its EEZ. The COFA states have a combined 5.5 million square kilometers in their EEZ. Guam and the CNMI become increasingly isolated rather than the vibrant home to countless regional relationships and centers, which they once were prominent for. There's lots of water in that lake, and most of it doesn't belong to the U.S. So as we face the prospect of the renegotiation of the compacts as they terminate in 2023, America must consider what its long-term purposes are for the broader Asian Pacific or Indo-Pacific region, if you want to use that term. America must think about the role of the islands within that purpose. While it makes those calculations, it must re-engage the islanders themselves in political and economic projects which are based on respect for the unique history of the islands, islander aspirations, and the right to a unique future. To view them as part of an American lake in today's world seems backward and colonialist. To see them as partners in a broader plan to democratize and humanize the world is the appropriate path to take. But only if that is what both the U.S. and the islands are seeking. To see the islands only as the base, a military base, and as a basis for military strength is to take us right back to those imperialistic and arrogant days of the early Cold War. In 2003, under Jerry's urging, I wrote that the compacts of free association would become more compact and less free due to American policy concerns over accountability for funds and the efficacy of spending billions for Micronesian entities. Then and now, I still think that accountability is an issue in the relationship between the freely associated states and the U.S. is highly exaggerated and pales in significance to reestablishing a peaceful and stable Asian Pacific region. The concern over accountability was so strong in the early part of this century that the Government Accounting Office, in response to congressional inquiries, concluded in 2002 that the value of strategic denial was overrated and irrelevant in the post-Cold War era. I offered that the American lake could be, in this same article, could be replaced with an American lagoon. You know, while largely enclosed, the lagoon is still kind of open to outside currents. Whether the lake or lagoon or river metaphors are in play is up to defense and foreign policy intellectuals. It is clear today that a lack of clear American national goals, as expressed through what ordinarily would be a coordinated state and defense department presence in the Trump era, exacerbates the situation as an inherently disruptive. The compacts will be renegotiated. The discussion over military presence in Guam and the Northern Marianas will continue, and there will be some efforts on Guam's part to negotiate a new political status. These intra-region trends will be ignored in the new era because the larger American national purpose in the region seems to lack focus right now. This spells uncertainty and undermines both America's national purpose and islander aspirations, which in combination go a lot further than military strategic purpose. Perhaps in another year or two it will all clear up. Maybe some people will be gone and we'll get back to normal business. And then we can focus on the region, the islands and the islanders themselves, and a healthier, a stable and secure world in which prosperity and democratic values and respect for others are standards to be pursued. Perhaps not. It's largely, but really, it largely depends on island leadership. It doesn't depend on Washington. It really depends on island leadership, which understands regional connections. It is clear that the regional vision will not emanate from Washington, D.C., except as an afterthought. The treatment of territories and the freely associated states as appendages, worthy only of sporadic attention, continues. In the absence of a clear policy, an alternative path will emerge. The region may fracture and the relationships will break down. But just telling the islanders, choose the United States or China will gobble you up, is not a satisfying path for people trying to plan their future. Si tus más es todo semblante, and thank you very much.
Are you willing to take some questions?
Sure.
All right. Floor is open.
you very much for your perspective from the islands about what's going on in the U.S. relationship with them. Since Guam is still somewhat of a spear point, even though we aren't sure which direction you pointed apparently now. Do you think there's any hope still possibly for some sort of change in the status of Guam?
There is, but as always, that really depends on local leadership and energy. So the power of the military to not just shape the debate, but to throw resources into the mix is it's enormous. And so the scale of that, you know, is in Guam's case, it's just so it's more dramatic even than the scale of the military here in Hawaii. And you know, I used to compare it to this having like having a 10-foot giant living in your house. Didn't matter whether the giant liked you, whether you were getting along, whether you were not getting along. Their sheer presence and their was going to be disruptive, and they're going to break the furniture, and you just, you know, you're just going to have to be thinking about them all the time, and it's out of whack. So I think that remains a major issue in Guam. But the fact that the military no longer looks as powerful in the broader world is also affecting how people think. So the American military is more boisterous than ever, but in actuality less prestigious than ever. And so there may be a relationship between that, you know, because people who are boisterous are usually people who are insecure, and they're not certain. They're uncertain about their own purpose. And so in this instance, you know, the military's role and its constant power plays. And you know, there's a lot. You know, I mean, you can't really fault local military commanders or people in uniform because they're just trying to do their job, and they only have 2 more years to do it, and then move on. So, you know, so that's the environment we're in.
Can I follow it up with one more thought? One of the reasons I think the U.S. has gotten away with this sort of strategic denial over most of Micronesia, apart from the military aspect itself, is economic dependency. You mentioned the Solomon Report, for example, which laid out a plan to develop the islands in such a way that they would want to remain tied to the U.S., which meant economically dependent on the U.S. But with China becoming an investor and trade partner and aid giver now in the region, do you see that leverage sort of evaporating?
Well, I think young people are seeing something different now than they ever thought before. I don't know very many, you know, it's one of the kind of things that islands are going through themselves, which is thinking about their sustainability as island entities, rather than just kind of manipulating their external relationships. As they get into that, and as younger people think about that, and as younger people go to schools in other places, you know, they're not all kind of tied into an American framework. As they do that, their models have certainly changed. So I think, you know, my confidence in young people has gone up because of the fact that the way they talk, the way they understand their relationship to their resources, the way they understand the development of their own economies, and the way they understand their relationships to the outside world. So, you know, of course, you know, Guam remains really problematic. It's painful for me to say that, because Guam, because in a way, the prosperity, the seeming prosperity is driven by huge amounts of federal spending. And at the end of the day, it might look more prosperous, but it's probably the island with the least amount of choices. That's the irony, and that's the flip side of that. So you deal with that, and it makes you don't feel too good. Okay.
Robert, thanks for an excellent talk. Given what you've described, the Pacific as being no longer an American link, what do you forecast for the renegotiations around the compacts of free association?
Well, you know, one way or another, they're going to renegotiate the compacts. But again, when they get around to doing that, it'll be kind of an afterthought. And they've had lots of time to think about it. So that's from the U.S. side of it. From the islander side of it, is the islander side, I think it's not, they're not as threatened by it as they used to be, which is a good feeling, you know. It's just you know, so that makes it more likely to take on a real negotiation. You know. So now the ability to migrate into the U.S. freely, now that becomes a negotiating point. You see. So I don't, you know, so actually, you know, that may in the future become the major reason why you want to continue the relationship, which is probably not a good idea, but you know, before the relationship was primarily economic, setting up the trust fund, you know, at least assuring some kind of governmental financial viability over time, just based on the trust fund. But now, migration itself has become an issue. So, and it's an issue that is valuable to, I think, more valuable to the islanders than it is to the U.S. And then the U.S. might use that. I think that will become a sticking point. Yes, sir.
Yeah, can I ask a couple of academic questions?
I'll give you an academic answer.
Please do. That's one that I can understand, and that's what you're touching. I'm just wondering if we're seeing, you talked about, you know, investment from the United States, investment from China, different categories, of course. We know the casino attraction and of course, the money laundering and triad influence that comes with that is pretty well known already. But I'm wondering, is there a longer-term plan? This is prompted by a book written a few years ago by two Spanish journalists called China's Third Army. And it was we have this imbalance population-wise in China between male and female. That's rather significant. And so in China's globalization over the last number of years, sending single workers overseas and kind of discourage them from returning and having them stay locally, marry locals, and then support them economically to put up small businesses. Seems to be a trend that's happening in the Pacific as well, even in the remote islands. And I'm just curious if the economic plan, besides the things you mentioned, is really a different kind of long-term game plan from the China side, to be so ingrained in the economy, and that the tourism link and the investment link, all these other low-level, you might say, penetration link economically, is that going to have an impact on China's ability to dictate to the leadership just because of local economy survivability down the line?
Well, you know, I mean, it's hard to characterize how the Chinese presence in just a single way, because it has been there for centuries. So, you know, there's almost no part of the island Pacific or Asia where Chinese haven't been there already, and also involved in some kind of local economic activity. But, you know, I'm always the Chinese seem to, well, first of all, they have a longer view of things than most people. That's the most important thing. I think they asked Zhou Enlai one time. They said, has the French Revolution had a positive influence or a negative influence on world history? And he said, it's too soon to tell. that whole kind of that whole kind of attitude makes them a little bit longer thinking than Americans. We're just than almost any other country. But I think anything that facilitates Chinese economic investment and activity overseas is looked upon with great favor by China, regardless of what the pressures are. And if there weren't these pressures, they would, exert other things. So, when you're trying to do like, I only do it at a very small level, but when you try to do business with a Chinese state enterprise, it's like, wow, it's just so complex. You can never really understand whose relationship to who. It's and I don't know that if I spoke Mandarin that it would make it any easier. Might, but it's a very and the networking. You talk about networking. It's like the original idea of how to network and how to utilize each other, and you can see that in a very small fashion, even in the Chinese community in Guam, where you see the ones that came from the mainland China 20 years ago or 30 years ago, and how they got there and how they're able to start businesses and so on. It doesn't look or feel like the guy just showed up one day and decided that he was going to be an entrepreneur. It looked like some kind of other part of something else. Not a specific strategy, but a way to facilitate that. So, and of course the more important part, I think, are these young people are going to school in China. I think that's just a different mindset, because they're just going to have a different worldview, and we're going to get them here to UH soon. The only problem is they won't go back home. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, sir, for a very insightful presentation. I'm Makandi from the Viernes states of Micronesia. I kept asking the military the question of whether Micronesian countries actually have any role during the Obama Tiffany rebalancing strategy. Now I'm confused if there's any at all during this Trump administration. What do you see as the role of Micronesian countries nowadays during this uncertain time?
Let's all go to Pacific Command and ask them. Because I know they're thinking about it. I know they're thinking about it. The issue there is not only the role, but the level at which you start thinking about the islanders. So when you're planning on, like, if you're running if you think you're in the National Security Council and you're trying to figure out what is in America's best interest, and you're synthesizing economic thought, and you're bringing in State Department people, and you're bringing in Department of Defense people, and you do that, at what level do you engage islanders in that process? And if you were talking about Asia, they would engage the Japanese pretty early, they'd engage the Koreans pretty early. But in this case, the islanders are not seen as serious participants. They're just people you have to placate. At the end, we'll decide what to do, and then when we get around to doing with the islanders, what do you want? You want more money? You want a new car? You want more access to the U.S.? What is it that you want that we can placate you with? So that's why I tried to flip that around, and I was trying to tell islanders, you have to be clear on what you want. Don't be waiting for them to figure out what they think is good for them and what role you play. You have to figure out what you want, because there's at almost no level, when I was in Congress, I don't care what policy you think of or what government program you think of, and I raise my hand or I go to an office and they'll say, well, why didn't you took Guam? Oh, it was an oversight. I'm so sorry. We know you're there, but it's just an oversight. I'm not, it's not we don't like you, or you're not part of our consciousness is what it is. It's just an oversight. So partially in jest, I introduced a bill called the Insular Areas Oversight Avoidance Act. And it's an actual bill. It's an actual bill that it shifts the responsibility. That you automatically assume that the territories are part of everything until the White House through OMB says that they shouldn't be, and they have to explain why not. See? So, because then we're just not part of that. We're just not part of their mindset. So that's why it's important that we kind of be clear. Huh? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Dr. Underwood, for such an inspirational speech. My question is a follow-up of Dr. Hanlin, and maybe part of it is Consul General Conti. I'm really interested in knowing if you were given the chance to be on the negotiating team.
After this speech, fat chance.
Two questions. So, what would be the top on your agenda? And there's a lot of young youth and students here from Micronesia in this room. What is your message to them?
Well, I think I've been pretty clear on that message. I think the idea is that we have to, and depending on where you're from, you have to figure out what it is that you want out of the relationship, because the relationship, the way that it's conceptualized in Washington D.C. or in other places, is that you're a second or third tier of consideration. So. As long as you're there, and so whatever policy that is decided will consider you as a factor to placate, not as a factor to integrate early on. It's like earlier in my professional life, I used to do cultural training, cross-cultural training, and I did it for the Air Force. And after 2 sessions, I said, wow, I'm going to in-service the whole Air Force here. I could spend the rest of my life, and I could in-service the whole Air Force on cross-cultural understanding. But what's the point of that? I'm going to spend the rest of my life doing that. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to correct misimpressions that they have about me and the people I come from. And why should I spend the rest of my life doing that? I'm not going to do that. I'm going to figure out what I want to do, and then I'm going to tell people what I want to do, and then they're going to have to deal with it, and they can ignore me if they want, whatever. That's really the issue. That's a kind of an internal kind of clarity process, So, the people who work for federal agencies, the military, they're all. Most of them are honest, hardworking people, and they'll come up with good ideas. Like in Guam, they came up with one Guam, green Guam. See, that was always when the military buildup was first conceptualized, and it was going to be like 30,000 people. And so the way they conceptualized, the way they advertised it was one Guam, green Guam. I said, one Guam. But, Guam's not really part of that decision, but it's their decision. And of course, they were going to change the environment a lot, so it was going to be less green, actually. But by coming up with this concept of one Guam, green Guam, was one of those Orwellian kind of ideas that would, get people to think that we were all in the same environmental agenda and the same political agenda. So it was, never going to work out. So that's really the nub of that, is to be really clear on what it is that you want for your future. So for young islanders that are really interested in the part about it that's engaged is not just people are interested in politics, but they're interested in sustainable lives and sustainable islands. That's really helping shape how people think about themselves. And I think that's probably one of the most positive things. So I certainly missed out on all that. I didn't really see that. I didn't envision that part of it. Me, I thought it was just all politics. So and activism. It's all politics and activism. And activism was only involved in politics and protests and doing things like that. Didn't realize that there were ways with which you can create a life, create a sustainable way of life, and how that energy, how that spirit, it's like, people ask me what it's like to be president of a university. I said, well, the first problem I have is I'm a 20th century person. I came to, my whole thing, the way I view the world, I came to adulthood and everything as a 20th century person, and now I'm dealing with 21st century people. I don't know what the world is like to a 21st century people. Just person, it just seems way different, And so that's one issue. So I'm trying to get out of that. I'm trying to kind of buy into that. And then in Guam especially, it used to be that a lot of people in the private sector saying, oh, these young people, they just want to work for the government of Guam, go to school and want to look and see if they can get some kind of fix from their relatives and work in the government of Guam, and they'll be happy for the rest of their lives. And that's really how it worked. And I tell people in the corporate world, and I said, here's the good news. Young people, they don't want to work for the government anymore. Here's the bad news. They don't want to work for you either. They don't want to work for the Bank of Guam or United Airlines. They don't want to work. They want to work for themselves. I said, it's just a whole different kind of way of thought. I said, well, to me, that's pretty engaging. That's pretty healthy. Okay.
I'm Takiota Ingram from the Cook Islands in the South Pacific, but I've worked a lot with people from Micronesia, Guam, and Northern Marianas, etc. And I head up a non-profit called the Pacific Writers Connection. And, Micronesia, Guam in particular, has produced some fantastic writers. And there's a young person here, Craig Santos Perez, who completed his PhD at UH in the English department.
And got tenure in 3 or 4 years.
Yes, and he's a great poet, and he's written a lot of poetry about demilitarizing Guam, and teaches a lot of the young people here, and a lot of other people from Micronesia, Polynesia, Melanesia. And I was just wondering, how can the voices of these writers become heard more, not only in Guam, but throughout the United States, because they're very passionate about getting rid of the military and becoming more of an independent country, like a lot of other Pacific Island countries. So what are your thoughts on that in terms of the power of poets and writers?
The power of that is great, but I'm going to put on my 20th century defense now and say, I have no idea. It's hard for me to imagine how to disseminate that kind of, that in this environment. Obviously there's, lots of different kinds of media available to us today, and there's a lot of competition for that. There's an enormous amount of competition, but as a general rule, I always kind of look back and go back to K through 12. If no one in K through 12 is teaching about this or sharing this with a 9-year-old and a 10-year-old and a 14-year-old, then it's going to take extraordinary effort for someone like Craig to rise to the top, because I'm sure when he was 13 years old, nobody was giving him that level of encouragement.
Right.
He had to have some kind of experience that just kind of brought his, unearthed his talents and brought it to the surface. So I would always argue that those kinds of things need to have be part of the balance of K through 12 education. It's like sustainability in thought, sustainability in spirit. It's more than just it's more than just being able to live on an island.
Again, I want to thank you for reminding us that we live in very different times politically in the United States. One of the most volatile places in the world is South Korea, is North Korea, South Korea, and Peninsula. And us not having a U.S. ambassador there tells you a lot about where the State Department stands right now. And it kind of makes you talk about historically. Which raises a question I want to ask. Back to Professor Hanlon's earlier question on the compact, the run-up to that. Even if elections make some kind of changes, we're going to be a lot closer to that compact during the next big election. My question is, given the interests of the Pacific leadership making their own decisions, and presumably you meant not just individual country, but Pan-Pacific kind of interaction too. What role would you see for the University of Hawaii and East-West Center, where we have this, fairly substantial contacts and activities going on already? How would we be able to assist maybe is too strong. How can we help catalyze that process through our institutions, so that in the absence of clear and defined U.S. policy, which I think will remain probably constant, unclear in the next 2 or 3 years, what can we do now? What should we be doing now? Not only among our two institutions, but also with the regional institutions like yours and other non-educational ones to help bring about more constructive thought.
Well, obviously the role of academic institutions is large in this, and the University of Guam, kind of for ourselves, kind of struggle with that. But on the other hand, I think we have to figure a way to help to not just help other academics and top political leaders. We really have to reach into young people and facilitate their activism. We have to find a way to facilitate that. So, many years ago, I ran a conference, Micronesia Nuclear Free. I ran that conference in the early '80s, and I brought my button, Make Micronesia Nuclear Free. So when I ran that conference, and I was the people who helped me do it were really, peace activists from Europe, and the money came over in guilders at that time. And I had to do all these transfers, and I monitored the money. I wanted to make sure I wasn't going to go to jail. My FBI file wouldn't grow so large, and I was very careful at that. But the role that played, I think, was enormous, And I'm trying to kind of find that balance between getting people in top leadership positions to meet and interact, and then getting people at another level to meet and act, because you have, the political leadership is always going to be used to meeting all the time. They're going to have meetings and they're responsible. But what about the second? What about upcoming leaders? And academics too are always going to find ways to meet with each other. So I'm not sure what that looks like. But, that seems.
President Underwood has been very generous with his time. Maybe
all right, one more question.
Yeah.
Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Underwood. You talk about this very interesting dynamic of a shameful sort of imperialist past and sort of boogeyman U.S. and its interest, and compare that to aspiring islanders who are wanting to grab their own future in these sovereign countries. I worry that recently, in current developments, it's oftentimes that particular past is sometimes used almost as an excuse for us as islanders not to pick up sort of our own governance issues, our own accountability issues, and it's almost easy to, oh well, this was done to us, and sometimes we feel a little less empowered to do things on our own. how do we differentiate between those two issues so that we can truly empower ourselves and really grab the reins of our own futures and move forward?
Well, if I knew the answer to that. No, that's a very important question. You know, the way that the world is shaped by big powers is that you either go with me or you get, if you don't go with me, there's this boogeyman. And then that boogeyman says, if you don't go with me, there's that boogeyman. And so that's a very unsatisfying and disempowering, and as you pointed out, a very disempowering way of looking at life. So, and then you have to figure out whether your own political leadership is complicit in that, which is yet another level, which is also kind of dispiriting. So, as always, it's like, you know, you just have to be louder. You just have to make your voice louder, and you have to participate in networks of like-minded people. Not to select the right boogeyman, you know, because that's a false choice. But it's really to kind of clarify what your own aspirations are. It's not seeking a way to, you know, end the pain of colonialism or deal with, you know, trying to figure out. It's like dealing with a series of grievances, you know. So when you plan your future, you don't outline all the things that went wrong, and you don't dwell on the grievances. You kind of try to figure out what you want to do right, and and so somewhere between the activism and the identification of the grievance, and you know, when you're a young person and you're 20 years old and you just start reading about this and you're going, wow, that's such a, they ripped us off, they fooled us, they hoodwinked us, they did this, they did that, how could we be so stupid? Well, that's not really, that doesn't really help you plan for the future. It's good to understand that, but there has to be something more than that. And that's, you know, giving voice. You have that young lady next to you, give her the voice. Give her the voice. Thank you very much.